There was this ruler, and around that ruler was a council. Within the council, you had ministers. Now, here is an interesting thing that he speaks about, and we must take that into consideration. He says that the council, as well as the council of ministers, had representation from all the four Varnas. This aspect is extremely important to notice. Why it is important to notice? Because the dominant narrative is that the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, they were involved in governance, and everybody else was denied a voice. But this is not what the reality is. There was participation from all the four Varnas, and all the four Varnas were represented in the Council of Ministers. Foundations of Indian culture. And in light of that, today we are going to discuss Indian polity, the 4 chapters that Sri Aurobindo has written in that same book. I also presume that you are familiar with the background in which this text was written. This was written in response to a person by the name of William Archer, who described India savage and uncivilized in as many ways as possible. Now, we may think that this was an anomaly. We may think that there was this individual who was putting journalistic vitriol in India. But that was not what the reality was. The reality was that describing India and Hindus as uncivilized, savage, uncouth, brute had become the dominant paradigm. It was the main framework in which India was being discussed when Sri Aurobindo wrote this text. Now, the reason why we do not come across something like this is because we are not exposed to the colonial narrative which was operational on us in post independent India, in post colonial India. And in a certain sense, you can say that this is a massive failing of the education system. The history that we are taught, particularly of the British colonial period, we are largely taught the massive drain of wealth that occurred during that period. That's a reality. No one can deny that. In fact, India was impoverished beyond measure. But there are many other things that also happened during the colonial period. And we are not taught about it. So, in fact, the narrative which Sri Aurobindo is refuting or has refuted was put in place at least 100 years ago. There was this gentleman by the name of James Mill who wrote this book called History of British India. And in History of British India, there are 7 chapters on the Hindus. And in those chapters, he has described Hindus as savages and uncouth in as many ways as possible. In a certain sense, you can say that he set the narrative. He got the ball rolling. And after this book got published and became famous, East India Company employed James Mill. And within a span of, say, about 11 years, James Mill became the CEO of East India Company. He was the chief sitting at India House in London. So this narrative which he had produced began to get a massive political backing. And gradually, what happened was that this narrative became part of the educational system of Britain first. And when universities began to get established in India, this narrative became part of the Indian educational system. And in a certain sense, you can say that this narrative hasn't really fizzled out even today. It is operational. It is not that explicit. It is not as explicit as it was described by James Mill. But the Hindu culture, Hindu ways, Hindu civilization, Hindu polity, they are still being described as hierarchical and oppressive in a manner very similar to how it was put in place by James Mill. This is still going on. So, particularly from this perspective and the history that we have, Sri Aurobindo's Foundations of Indian Culture is as relevant today as it was when Sri Aurobindo had initially written it. So people who are interested in Renaissance in India, that it becomes important that we read and reread this text and really understand the nuances that he is speaking about. This context is extremely important because if you would see, in the first chapter itself of the Indian polity, he is doing a Purvaksha. He describes that the Indian political system, the traditional Indian political system, is described as hierarchical and oppressive, described as caste ridden, described as a system where people participation was none, described as a system where the voice of people never mattered, described as a system where there was no presence of democracy whatsoever. Now, why his chapters become important? I would say that 99.9% educated people in India today would say that democracy is an implant of the Western world on the Indian soil. This is the power of the narrative. And this is what the belief is at this point in time. How did this belief actually get established? It is because of the narrative. And that's why, the refutation of this narrative becomes incredibly important. And therefore, it becomes important to understand how Indian polity evolved over a period of time. Now, there are some isolated facts that I'm putting in front of you. And then we will stitch them together. Amongst the post colonial countries, you'll be surprised. India is the only country which has had an almost seamless run with democracy. If you take out that brief period when Indira Gandhi introduced emergency in India, India has been a democratic nation since independence. Amongst the post colonial nations, India is an exception. Second isolated fact. You must have read in your history books that Akbar established two houses, if you will, Diwane Khas and Diwane Aam. Let these facts remain. Through the Panchayati Raj, there is vibrant democracy present in India even today. How do these facts basically get accounted for in the writings of Sri Aurobindo? If you would go through the chapters, Sri Aurobindo says that the evolution of Indian polity underwent a few stages. The first stage, of course, was when the society was at a rudimentary level. Small settlements, people scattered in small settlements, migrating from one place to another. In Vedic India, this collectivity is called Visha. He says that initially matters concerning governance and social relevance were decided in collectivity in various sabhas that you actually have. The concept of monarchy was not there. Society grew, and then it was realized that there needs to be a leader or a ruler who needs to oversee the people. This individual was democratically elected. Now, when I'm talking about democracy, we need to understand that Sri Aurobindo is speaking about an Indian brand of democracy. He's not talking about the Western brand, which is prevalent at this point in time. So, this nuance or this description is very, very important. Or rather, you can say that this caveat is very important. So, there has been an Indian brand of democracy, and that is the kind of democracy that we are trying to understand in this brief meeting that we are having. This became hereditary over a period of time. Now, with the growth in society, the four Varnas also came into existence, four classes of people. In the earlier stages, all these four Varnas were participating in the governance under the leadership of the ruler. There's a third stage, you know, that he describes. The stage of the consolidation of monarchy. And he says that this happened after the invasion of Alexander, when it was realized that it is important to have one consolidated state. And Kautilya made a massive contribution towards this. However, he also says that before the monarchical system came into existence, there was this conflict which was occurring within the society with respect to republican forms of governance versus the monarchical form of governance. And these republican forms of governance are described quite nicely in Buddhist literature. Why it is described in Buddhist literature? Buddha himself came from an area where republican form of governance was employed. His father was one of those heads. So, governance was done by elected people, people who were representatives of the people. And Sri Aurobindo, in the third chapter, he also talks about the inclusion of this form of governance when he formed Sangha later, when he put together the monastic form of governance, when he put together Sangha, then matters were deliberated upon and they were put to vote. Sri Aurobindo describes this. Now, when you come to the monarchical form of governance, which became a reality for most part of India, or for most part of Hindu India, for at least 17, 1800 years, depending upon the region that we are speaking about. This system was not as it was described by quote unquote the British historians. It is a very different system of governance. Sri Aurobindo says that at the apex was the king or the ruler. In fact, he also has made this point that there were women folk in governance as well. And we know from our history that there have been many queens who have ruled. So there certainly was space in Indian polity for women rulers. So instead of king, I think we should use the term ruler. So there was this ruler, and around that ruler was a council. Within the council, you had ministers. Now, here is an interesting thing that he speaks about, and we must take that into consideration. He says that the council as well as the council of ministers had representation from all the four varnas. This aspect is extremely important to notice. Why it is important to notice? Because the dominant narrative is that the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, they were involved in governance and everybody else was denied a voice. But this is not what the reality is. There was participation from all the four varnas, and all the four varnas were represented in the Council of Ministers. Now, around the ruler and the council, you had two very powerful assemblies. Sri Aurobindo calls them Metropolitan Assembly and General Assembly. And then he describes them. Now, earlier I was talking about an isolated fact, right? Diwane Aam and Diwane Khas are basically reflection of that system of governance. Within the Muslim form of governance in India, at least, these two bodies were non-existent. They were introduced by Akbar. When you look at Akbar and when you look at his governmental policies, he stands out amongst Delhi Sultans and other Mughal rulers. And if you look at the graph of economic decline of India in about 2000 years, you will find that in, or rather during the rule of Akbar, there's a certain spike in the graph. Through his governmental policies, Akbar largely was able to establish harmony within the society, particularly in his later years. And this harmony that he established also showed in the rise of economic activity within the Indian civilization. So Diwane Khas and Diwane Aam, were reflections of these two assemblies that Sri Aurobindo speaks about. The Paura Assembly and the General Assembly. The Metropolitan Assembly was basically located at the capital of the state. And Metropolitan Assembly had representation, once again, from all the four Varnas and from the various guilds that were present in the Nagara. Sri Aurobindo goes on to describe that it was basically this assembly which was involved in the maintenance of the city almost completely. And this they did through various administrative bodies, including committees. Matters concerning the public were discussed in these assemblies, and the Metropolitan Assembly was a powerful assembly in the sense that if there was a consensus on a particular matter, then it was binding upon the king, the ruler, and the council to basically follow it. The assembly represented the will of the people. This is extremely important. The people participation in governance was a very, very important principle. Then you had General Assembly. General Assembly also had representatives from all the four Varnas, coming from villages, mandalas, and so on and so forth. So if the Metropolitan Assembly reflected the will of people living in cities, General Assembly reflected the will of people living in villages. And Sri Aurobindo also says that the members of these two committees met together from time to time, just like Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha meet for discussion of important matters. These two assemblies met to take decisions on important matters, and the decisions were basically conveyed to the ruler and the council. Arthashastra is very candid in stating this. In the happiness of the people lies the happiness of the king. And it also says that the king or the ruler has to be self-denying in his or her approach towards the people should consider the people as children whose needs have to be taken into account first before one engages in one's own needs. Now, there's another factor which was working on the polity. This was the rule of dharma. Dharma was the umbrella under which everyone was working, including the ruler. So the respect that the ruler commanded was in proportion to the following of dharma by this individual. If the ruler was not seen dharmic, the ruler began to lose the confidence of people. And both the council as well as these two assemblies that we spoke about had the power to remove the ruler. And that is why when you look at Indian history, you will find from time to time instances of change of ruler by people, by these different bodies that we spoke about. So this whole idea that the people participation in Hindu India in matters of governance was non-existent is nothing but a piece of baloney. It is nothing but falsehood. This is also the reason why you will find a vibrant democracy in India. In any public space, you will find Indian people discussing politics. In buses and trains, and in particularly trains. The main conversation is around politics. So, this whole idea that democracy is a Western transplant on the Indian soil is completely bogus. And it is evident in how people behave toward governance. It's a different matter altogether that that their voice may not be getting heard, as opposed to how it was earlier. But people still discuss matters. Now there's another factor that needs to be accounted for. In post-independent India, there were efforts made to make the Indian people not vote along jati lines. It has not succeeded so far. What is the reason? Jati and Varna based voting for sending representatives to different bodies of governance has been happening in India since antiquity. It's not a question, whether it is good or bad. I'm not talking about that. What I'm saying is that it is basically because of this ancient practice that the practice of sending representatives to different governance bodies in current India based on quote unquote caste lines hasn't really disappeared. What is the difference between Western brand of democracy and Indian brand of democracy? Western brand of democracy talks about individual self-determination. The Indian brand of democracy spoke about communal self-determination. Self-determination was important. Self-determination is always important in the midst of any collectivity, including family. In my understanding, a good parent is one who is able to identify the unique traits of his or her child and supports the process of growth of that child along those lines. Instead of imposing on the child what the parent believes is right. This also, interestingly, is the foundation of the Varna system. People are constituted differently. People have different aspirations, different uh, desires for participating in the human collectivity. That inner aspiration through the vocation of the individual has to be honored. That was the basis of the Varna system. I'm pretty much sure. The ideas of Sabhav and Swadharma have already been spoken about, so I would not go into those details. But this whole idea, that there is this oppressive hierarchical system which is not taking into account people participation or the voice of people is something which was completely alien to the Hindu civilization. Now, before I open the floor for questions, I want to go into just a bit of details of how this representation came about. This individual, James Mill, who wrote History of British India, never came to India. He had no personal experience of India. He basically wrote the history sitting in his closet in London. That's what he did. And he was also an individual who has played an instrumental role in the transformation of the British society. You will be surprised if you will read the history of 19th century England that there was literally no people participation in governance, almost none whatsoever. What was the form of governance that they had? They, of course, had monarchy. They had these two houses, House of Lords and House of Commons, which interestingly was established in England in 1688 after the British people had already come in contact with India. And given that House of Lords and House of Commons are almost exact translations of Diwane Aam and Diwane Khas, I am of the view that even this introduction within the British system of governance happened after Britain's exposure to India. British governance occurred at that point in time through monarchy and aristocracy. And the aristocrats in these two houses were chosen by very few people. And they too were amongst the aristocrats. There wasn't any secret ballot, which was going on in England. There was no voting which occurred in England. So, in a certain sense, you can say that Britain at that point in time was actually engaging in a very hierarchical and oppressive form of governance. And James Mill speaks about that in great detail. All those writings that he did for England are actually here in this book, Political Writings by James Mill. So you get a good sense of what was occurring in England at that point in time. So, in the light of his British experience, with respect to governance, imagined governance in India, whatever was imagined by him became the dominant narrative. And this dominant narrative, because it has become part of our own educational system, we have internalized. And this narrative, incidentally, is still going on. Pick up any NCERT book, sixth grade onwards. In explicit and implicit ways, if you will come across the Hindu form of governance or Hindu Rajas and Ranis, you will always find them described as hierarchical and oppressive. That the ruler was the representative of Dharma, ruling in light of the will of people or in consonance with the will of people is something which is non-existent in the narrative even today. Therefore, whenever democracy is spoken about, people begin looking at the West and they forget what the reality or what the actual reality was within the Hindu context, within the Indian context. I understand that reading Sri Aurobindo is not very easy. It can be a bit of a task. But if you will go through these chapters gradually and slowly, if you would read the lines and if you would read in between the lines, you will find that you get a very different kind of reality of Indian governance, which actually agrees with the historical records that we have. And it also agrees with our collective behavior in terms of people's voice and people's participation. And moving forward, I personally think that these writings will become very, very important in India's Renaissance. There's a certain churning which is happening in India at this point in time. People have started questioning the narrative, the construction of the narrative, the context in which certain narratives were created, the impact of those narratives. There are simmering voices here and there. But after a certain point in time, these voices are going to become a chorus. And once the chorus happens, the shift will take place. It has to happen. In Renaissance in India, what is Sri Aurobindo saying? He's saying that we need to recover things of the past and then use them in understanding and shaping the present. I'm not saying this verbatim, but this is basically what he's saying in one of the chapters in Renaissance in India. Recover the spiritual knowledge. Let it flow in philosophies, sciences, art, craft, architecture, and so on and so forth. And interpret the current problems, the current social problems in that light. The words of Yogi never go waste. I believe in this. They won't go waste. This is a collective yagya which is happening, and I feel that people who are participating in this yajna need to do their own homework. And particularly the younger people who are here should think about becoming part of academia and writing on these matters. The education in India at this point in time, particularly in social sciences, is absolutely dismal with respect to the subject matter that we engage in and teach. It's all coming from the West, including the Western representation of ancient India. This is not going to change until unless people participate in changing that discourse. So I'm specifically saying this to the younger people that there is need to change the narrative. And this narrative will not get changed politically. This is not going to happen. What has to be changed through scholarly means can only be changed through scholarly means, not through politics. Having said that, I want to stop here. My idea was to basically give you a sense of, these chapters that Sri Aurobindo has written on Indian polity. I can tell you from my own experience that I've read and reread them. And every time that I read these chapters, I get new insights. So continue to engage with them. And whatever comes out from these readings or from this endeavor, try to basically use that in your social context. Now, I said something to the students. I want to say something to the people, who are in, in positions of governance. Wherever you are, always have an eye of the people, an ear for the people who are considered your subordinates. Be as inclusive as possible in governance. And if you will do this, you will be a leader who will be truly loved and respected. This is something which runs in our fabric even today. Be humane, be compassionate, and listen to the voices of the people in a genuine way. And you will see that you will command their genuine respect and their love and affection. This is what our civilization has done since antiquity. This is part of our collective consciousness and unconsciousness. If you will tap into that, you will be massively effective as governors and leaders for the Indian civilization. In fact, there's another problematic narrative which is prevalent in the history books in India. This is that Ashoka promoted Buddha Dharma. This is not true. This is completely not true. Now, why do I say this? Ashoka promoted Dharma. Ashoka did not promote Buddha Dharma. Ashoka, till a certain point in time, was a very cruel king. He was known as Chandashok. What Kalinga War did for him was that it led to a change of his heart, not a change, in his quote unquote religious orientation, change of heart, because he had already converted, quote unquote converted, to Buddhism. I don't think the the scheme of conversion actually existed in India. You had different paramparas, you had different traditions. People followed different traditions. So he had started following, the tradition of Buddha way before the Kalinga War. The bloodshed that he saw in Kalinga War led to a change in heart. And after that, he began engaging in practices to become Dhamma Ashoka. And I think, he became one. And therefore, when you look at his various rock edits, there are two things that you will find. One is that he's speaking about Dhamma, and all the descriptions of Dharma actually tally with what is described in the Arthashastra, which was written only two generations before. And on many accounts, he's basically talking about Raj Dharma. And he's behaving exactly in the manner in which the Dharma of a king is described in Arthashastra. And Arthashastra, basically is a reflection of the larger Dharma Shastra or the Dharma Shastras that were prevalent at that point. So, going back to the question, I would rather want to discuss these issues than the kings, who were removed.
So one thing you mentioned that British governance system changed with the infusion of Indian democratic ideas. So if you could say about some books, materials, or anything, so that one can deep
Um,
dive into those.
yeah, I'm actually developing that. I'm developing that at this point in time. It's another year or so. I will be releasing something on this matter.
That would be really nice, sir.
James Mill was certainly an individual who was talking about schools for all. Even education was not prevalent in the British society on a massive scale. Education was limited to people within clergy and aristocracy. You know,
Yeah.
so it was extremely limited, and this individual is talking about schools for all, and uh, we have clear evidence that education was for all, at least in southern India, in that time frame, in that time period. There was nearly 100% literacy in Madras Presidency, which was surveyed between 1822 and 1825. And there was this individual by the name of Andrew Weil, who traveled in southern India, and he came back to England in 1797. And then he started a movement on a very small scale for education of all. He was doing that, within the Church of England, whereas when James Mill got involved in the movement, he was mainly talking about what can be considered as secular education. But even this education for all is an idea which the Britishers actually got from India, and there's very clear evidence of that. So, British society has been massively transformed by the British contact of India, and we have not gone into those details. And why would we go into the details? Because if we are taught right from the very beginning that civilization has come to us from the West, you know, the likelihood of us opening to something that we could have contributed in the growth of the West is something which is not going to come into our consciousness. You see, so this is what the problem is. You know.
Sir, I would like to take one question and then we can end. It
Sure.
one of the criticism that is being pointed out at us is that no doubt we have a wonderful history and there are various good models of governance, social order, but we lack being imaginative or recreating the future, because as we see that the parliamentary form of democracy in India is failing, but we are unable to give a new shape to the alternative models. What's your
Yeah.
take on this?
See, Abhishek, until unless you don't understand your past properly, you will never be able to understand your present and your future. You know, so thinking that you will be able to make a solid intervention or profound intervention in the present for the future without understanding the past never happens. You know, so instead of creating this past, future dichotomy, it is important to see the entire continuum. Understanding of the past, will help you understand the present, which will help you make a solid intervention in the future. It's not that the past has disappeared from the Indian consciousness, from the Indian culture. Culture does not operate that way. Everything about the culture is not conscious. Culture largely is unconscious for most people, and it requires a lot of internal inquiry to really understand the influence of culture on one's consciousness. So all this happened, within in the past is still working within the Indian consciousness. I gave you an example, right? What is an effective form of leadership or governance within the Indian society? Be inclusive. Listen to people. You will be a powerful leader, who who cannot be easily dislodged. But what is the form of governance, which most Indians follow at this point in time? A form of governance which has been imposed on us by the Britishers. Most educated Indians, particularly in matters of governance, consciously or consciously are hierarchical and oppressive. Indians love yes men. They love them. I'm telling you. And this is our greatest failing. We don't, most educated Indians at this point in time, they do not believe in deliberation of matters and taking decisions within a collectivity. You'll rarely come across people, who will say, okay, here is a matter, let's table it for discussion, and and whatever emerges from this discussion is what is going to is going to get implemented. This whole idea of the boss culture, that works in the colonial framework. In the corporate world, does not work, if civilization wants to take the lead. The Western form of governance usually, is not very hierarchical and oppressive, interestingly. So what the colonial experience has done is that it has disconnected us from our past, right? And the West has taken things from India and reformed itself. So there's, in decolonizing or decoloniality that you're talking about, I am seeing a very problematic trend. I do not know if this trend will get arrested or not. There's a very strict dichotomy which is getting created of India and the West. India and West are not separate entities. The West has been influenced by India, and India and the West has influenced India. There's a reciprocal relationship. So for saying, what is Western and what is Indian, that requires a far deeper inquiry than what people are saying at this point in time. It is, it's good to rile up people, by saying, okay, here is the Western model, we are, which we are imposing on the Indian society. Yes, there's truth to that. I'm not denying it, But in terms of exchange, there's a far deeper reality than this very simplistic dichotomy, which is getting created in the name of decoloniality or decolonization. Maybe it's the past part of the process, but if it goes too far, it will be problematic. Like, let's say, for instance, when people say, when they talk about secularism or the separation of state and religion, and they attribute it, continually, to to West. specifically. Yes, within a particular social context, this emerged, and this has helped West nicely. But India has had its own form of separation of state and quote unquote religion. Why do I say this? The evidence is there in Arthashastra. There was strict injunction on the ruler not to be imposing his tradition. By that I mean the religious tradition, culture, language on the ruled, on the governed. And that is why, I say that Ashoka was not imposing Buddhism on the people. That's not what he was doing. If he would have done that, he would have gone in opposition to the Arthashastra and Dharma Shastras. And if he would have done that, instead of becoming Dhammashok, he would have remained a Chandashok. So, what I'm saying is that, as we engage in decolonization, decoloniality, whatever we may say at this point in time, there requires, a deeper knowledge of what is Indian and what is Western, and how this interchange has shaped and reshaped the West. It is it will take some time, for people to develop this. And that is why, my understanding is that we need to shake off this intellectual laziness, this intellectual tamas, which has actually befallen us. We will need to create scholars in the true sense, how it was, in the ancient times. I'm not talking about Brahman as a jati. I'm talking about Brahman in terms of one's guna. The Brahmins, they engaged in scholarship and nothing but scholarship. Now, until unless, we create that condition in India where scholars just engage in rigorous scholarship, for their entire lifetime, the transformation is not going to happen, because, the it's a sea of knowledge or information that you actually have to wade through. It's not a simple matter. It's not a simple matter. So I understand. That that there is this movement which is going on in terms of coloniality and decoloniality, but it's in my assessment of the situation, it's a very, very preliminary movement. It requires a far deeper nuance and a far deeper engagement.
Thank you, Kundan Singh ji. Actually, the thing you mentioned about the current movement of decoloniality, I personally had some kind of inhibition towards the movement that's been going on, because there, uh, as you mentioned, the strict dichotomy between West and East, or West and India, and without seeing the interaction and the influence, is not the, or let's say, is not the final journey of this movement. And even though it's been very popular in social media as nowadays, but it's not a scholarly work. And thank you for clearing so much doubt. Personally, for me, this is the best session we had in this course, and we look forward to you.
Absolutely, and if people have more questions, I'm here. See, uh, yes, time is important, but it is also important, in my understanding, Abhishek, to basically exhaust all the questions and the queries that they may have. See, if you actually look at the uh, traditional form of education, and Rekhaji, I want to say this to you as well. The traditional form of education in India has been very dialogical, very, very dialogical. It is not only there uh, in the Upanishads, but even in my lifetime, where I've spent my formative years in a village in India, if I remember, going to a village school, that the the teacher student relationship was dialogical. You know, in my elementary education, uh, you know, in the village school, I don't remember, a teacher coming to the class and giving a lecture. I don't remember that, and it is not because he or she did not know things. You know, would basically start the session with a question, and with the question, basically the unpacking of the material began. You see, so it is very important. It's very, very important to dialogue. It's very important, to move away from a didactic form of education to a dialogical form of education. And once again, people who are in the business of education, it is very important that you create space for that. And and again, once again, you know, in that engagement, what is it that you are doing? As a teacher in a position of authority, you are in contact with the inner reality, with the subjective reality of your student. You're listening to the student very, very keenly. And when you will begin to engage in something like this, you will find that the students will not run away from your class. Education must address the inner needs of an individual. It must go here. You know, whatever you are saying, if it is making sense to an individual, if if it makes the individual feel that whatever he or she is engaging in interaction with the teacher is going to shape his or her life, you know, he or she will remain engaged with it. In a certain sense, teaching is also a very self-denying and non-egotistical or non-egoical exercise. We all like to become teachers. You know, it's something which requires tremendous amount of humility and engagement, and that is why in Vivek Churamani, one of the characteristics of a teacher is that he or she should be compassion incarnate, love incarnate. So yeah, so having said that, I would say that let's exhaust the questions. We have time, and we should have time. We should make time for dialogue. That's what I would say. I'm here, and unless you feel that you need to close the session.
I had a small doubt on the part that you told that the voting pattern is slightly based on the caste system and it can be attributed to the past behavior of representation of varnas to the different bodies. So, how much can we attribute to it? Because that system was discontinued for a long time and for the most part of the India. So, whether it is
Yeah,
just a social thing or can we really attribute that to that particular past behavior?
yeah. That's a very good question. You pronounce your name as Vagish?
Yeah.
Vagish, okay. So, Vagish, as I was telling you, that most things about culture, you know, are actually unconscious. They are not conscious. It is not you know, at the manifest level that things are happening. Things are subterranean. So there are a lot of things, which you will experience, um, within the Indian culture, of which you have not studied or read. Like, let's say, for instance, the respect for elders, right, is something which is part of the Indian culture. It's a different matter that a lot of elders actually misuse that, in after having come in contact, with the Western world. But that that age has to be respected is something which you find in the Dharma Shastras coming from the ancient times. Education needs to be valued, you know. So there's a quote unquote there's an hierarchy with respect to uh, what needs to be respected over what, that is described in these texts. And when you will look at the Indian culture, and more so in rural India than in urban India, you will find that these practices are still in place. But if you ask the people there, why do you do this? Where is it coming from? They will not be able to give you an answer. Like, let's say, for instance, I know that that in your practice, conscious as well as unconscious, you have been respecting elders, or you have been respecting age. But did you know, before I said this to you, that this is an injunction on the Indian people coming from the Dharma Shastra, right? So, so this is how culture actually works. So if we can actually extrapolate this example that I gave you, you will see that many of the practices of the past, you know, are continuing in India even today. Does that address your question?
And I had another doubt. Matlab, it
Mm-hmm.
was actually like in Sanjeev Sanyal's book,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he describes Ashoka as, matlab, he describes that Ashoka didn't change even after the Kalinga War. For that, he has given some material, some descriptions of the tablet that says that if you don't agree with me, then I will punish you in a several ways, like and several other accounts. So I find kind of conflicting both views, yours views and Sanjeev Sanyal's.
No, that's why it's not conflicting. It's not conflicting. Why it is not conflicting is because in those edits, Ashoka was not talking about Buddha Dharma. He was talking about the Raj Dharma. He was talking about the Arthashastra principle. And Danda, was very much a part of the Arthashastra. And that is what he's talking about. So there is no contradiction. It's like he may have started following Buddhism for his individual personal practice, before the Kalinga War. But even after the Kalinga War, when he's spreading Dharma, he's not spreading Dharma of the Buddha for administrative matters. You know, he is basically talking about the Dharma of the Arthashastra. You see, does that remove your doubt?
Yeah. So that's Raj Dharma was. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think, sir, there are no more questions. Actually, there is lot to reflect and contemplate after this lecture. So, and I'm sort of words to pay the gratitude to you. So thank you, sir,
Thank
for
you. Thank
this
you.